The tin flowers caught the afternoon sun like 1,000 tiny mirrors, transforming ordinary fence posts into something that made Clara Montgomery's heart ache with both pride and loneliness as she hammered the last piece into place along the western boundary of what used to be her father's ranch in the New Mexico Territory, 1881. She stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dust across her pale skin, and surveyed the quarter-mile of fence she had spent 3 months adorning with flowers she had cut and shaped from old tin cans, coffee tins, and any scrap metal she could find in the dilapidated barn. The ranch had fallen into disrepair after her father's death 6 months ago, and at 22 years old, Clara found herself alone on 300 acres of land that seemed determined to return to the wild desert from which it had been carved. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, shading her eyes against the glare of the setting sun. A lone rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the orange and pink sky, and Clara's hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the fence post beside her. Strangers were common enough on the trail that ran past her property, but a woman alone had to be cautious. As the rider drew closer, she could make out more details. A tall man on a paint horse, wearing a dusty brown hat and a worn leather vest, with a red bandana tied loosely around his neck. He slowed his horse to a walk as he neared her fence line, and she noticed he was staring at her tin flowers with an expression that was hard to read. "Evening, ma'am," he called out, his voice deep and pleasant, with a slight drawl that suggested he had spent time in Texas. He pulled his horse to a stop about 10 feet from where she stood and removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that was slightly too long and curled at the ends. His face was lean and sun-weathered, with strong features and eyes that were an unusual shade of green, like the cottonwood leaves after a rare summer rain. "I hope you'll forgive my intrusion, but I had to stop. You have made this ranch look like a painting." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She was not accustomed to compliments, especially not from handsome strangers with kind eyes and voices that seemed to wrap around her like warm honey. "Thank you," she managed, her voice coming out more breathless than she intended. "I have been working on it for some time now." The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse closer but stopping at a respectful distance. Up close, Clara could see he was probably in his mid-20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days' worth of stubble, and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. "My name is James Callahan," he said, holding his hat in both hands. "I've been working cattle drives between here and Texas for the past 5 years, and I pass this way twice a year. I remember this ranch from before when your father was alive, if I'm not mistaken. It looks different now, better somehow, despite the repairs it needs." "Clara Montgomery," she replied, extending her hand in a gesture that was perhaps too forward for a proper lady, but she had given up pretending to be proper when she had buried her father and decided to keep the ranch running by herself. James took her hand gently, and she felt calluses on his palm that spoke of hard work and long days in the saddle. His grip was firm but not crushing, and he held her hand just a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. "Montgomery," James repeated thoughtfully. "I remember your father. He was a good man, fair in his dealings. I'm sorry for your loss." His sympathy seemed genuine, not the perfunctory condolences she had received from the townspeople in Santa Rosa, who had waited like vultures for her to fail so they could buy her land for pennies on the dollar. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, then gestured to the fence. "My father always said this ranch needed something to make it feel like home, not just a place to work. He died before he could do much about it, so I decided to try something myself. Everyone in town thinks I'm crazy, wasting time on decorations when there is real work to be done." James walked closer to the fence, studying the tin flowers with genuine interest. Each one was different, Clara noticed him noticing. Some were simple 5-petaled shapes, while others were more elaborate, with multiple layers and carefully hammered details that caught the light. She had painted some of them with whatever paint she could find or afford, so there were splashes of red, yellow, and blue among the natural silver of the tin. "This is not crazy," James said firmly, turning to look at her with those green eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. This is art, and it is hope. Anyone who cannot see that is a fool. Something in Clara's chest loosened at his words, a tension she had been carrying for months without realizing it. "Would you like some water?" she asked impulsively. "For you and your horse? It is a long ride to anywhere from here, and the sun is still hot." James smiled, and Clara found herself thinking that she had been right about those laugh lines. "I would appreciate that very much, Miss Montgomery, if it is not too much trouble." "Clara," she corrected him, "and it is no trouble at all." She led him toward the small ranch house, which was built of adobe in the Spanish style, with a covered porch that provided precious shade. The house needed repairs too, Clara knew. Several roof tiles were cracked, and the whitewash on the walls was peeling, but it was solid, and it was hers. She had a well near the house with good water, one of the reasons her father had chosen this spot to build, and she drew up a bucket for James's horse while he loosened the saddle girth to let the animal breathe easier. "How long have you been managing the ranch alone?" James asked as his horse drank deeply from the trough Clara kept filled. "6 months since my father died," Clara replied, drawing another bucket for them to drink from. "But he was sick for a year before that, so I've been doing most of the work for longer than that." She poured water into 2 tin cups and handed one to James, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "That is a heavy burden for anyone," James said carefully. "Do you have help? Hired hands?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money? My father spent everything he had on doctors, and it did not save him in the end. I have 10 head of cattle left, a dozen chickens, 1 milk cow, and a barn cat who barely tolerates me. I'm trying to build the herd back up, but it is slow going." James sipped his water, his expression thoughtful. "I'm heading back to Texas in a few days, back to the ranch where I have been working. But I'm tired of working for other men, tired of the trail. I have been saving my wages, looking for a place to settle down, maybe start my own herd." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I do not suppose you would be looking for a partner, someone to help with the heavy work in exchange for a share of the profits once the ranch is profitable again?" Clara stared at him, wondering if this was some kind of joke or if he was the kind of man who thought a woman alone was easy prey. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity and perhaps a weariness that matched her own. "You do not even know me," she said slowly. "Why would you offer something like that?" "I know you are someone who makes tin flowers for fence posts when you could be spending that time on practical matters," James said with a slight smile. "I know you are someone who sees beauty as necessary, not frivolous. I know you are strong enough to keep this place running alone, which means you are stronger than most men I have worked with. And I know that something about this place feels right to me in a way nothing has felt right in a long time." Clara wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to accept this gift that seemed to have fallen from the sky like rain in the desert. But she had learned to be cautious, to protect herself. "I would need to think about it," she said carefully, "and we would need to draw up proper papers, make it legal. I will not lose this ranch to anyone, no matter how kind they seem." "Fair enough," James agreed without hesitation. "I would not expect anything less from a woman smart enough to run a ranch alone. I will be staying in Santa Rosa for the next week, finishing some business with the cattle company I work for. You can think about my offer and send word to me at the hotel if you are interested. No pressure, no obligations." They talked for another hour as the sun set, sitting on the porch steps and sharing the simple dinner Clara had prepared, beans and cornbread with a little precious bacon for flavor. James told her about growing up in Kansas, about losing his own parents to cholera when he was 16, about the years since then spent drifting from job to job and place to place. Clara found herself telling him things she had not told anyone about her mother who had died when Clara was 10, about her father's dreams for the ranch, about her own dreams that she had almost given up on. When James finally mounted his horse to leave, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "Thank you for your hospitality, Clara," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "And thank you for letting me see your tin flowers up close. They are even more beautiful than they looked from the road." "Thank you for stopping," Clara replied, and meant it. She stood on the porch and watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, and felt something stirring in her heart that she had thought long dead. The next 3 days were torture for Clara as she tried to decide what to do about James's offer. The practical part of her brain cataloged all the work that needed to be done on the ranch, work that was beyond her ability to do alone, no matter how strong or determined she was. The wary part of her brain whispered warnings about trusting strangers, about men who made promises they did not keep. But there was another part, a part she had been trying to ignore for years, that remembered the way James had looked at her tin flowers with genuine appreciation, the way his smile had made her feel warm inside, the easy comfort of talking with someone who seemed to understand her. On the 4th day, Clara saddled her father's old gelding and rode into Santa Rosa, a small town of perhaps 300 people that served the surrounding ranches and farms. The town consisted of one main street with a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses. Clara tied her horse outside the hotel, a 2-story wooden building that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind, and went inside. The clerk at the desk, a pinched-faced man named Herbert, who had never liked Clara's father, looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "Can I help you?" he asked in a tone that suggested he would rather do anything else. "I'm looking for James Callahan," Clara said, keeping her voice level and polite. "I believe he is staying here." Herbert's eyes narrowed. "Room 6, upstairs. Though I do not know what business a respectable woman would have visiting a man's room." Clara felt anger flash through her, but she kept it off her face. She had dealt with men like Herbert her entire life, men who thought women should stay home and leave the world to men. "Then it is fortunate that my business is none of your concern," she said coolly, and walked past him to the stairs. She knocked on the door of room 6, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. James opened it after a moment, and she saw surprise cross his face, followed by something that looked like pleasure. He was in his shirt sleeves with his suspenders hanging down, and his hair was damp as if he had just washed it. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded good in his voice. "Please, come in. I apologize for the state of things." The room was small and sparse, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. James hastily put on his vest and gestured for Clara to take the chair while he sat on the edge of the bed. "I have been thinking about your offer," Clara said without preamble, "and I want to accept it, but I have conditions." James leaned forward, his full attention on her. "I am listening." "First, everything has to be legal and proper. We draw up papers that say you are a working partner with a percentage of the profits, not an owner. The land stays in my name. Second, you build yourself a bunk in the barn, or we add a room onto the house. I will not have people saying improper things about us. Third, you work for 6 months before you get any share of profits, to prove you are serious about this and not just looking for an easy way to take my ranch." "Agreed to all of it," James said immediately, "and I will add a condition of my own. If at any time you want me to leave, for any reason, I will go with no argument and no claim on anything. Your word is law in your land, and I will respect that." Clara felt relief wash through her. "Then we have a deal," she said, extending her hand. James took it, and they shook on it, and Clara could not help but notice how right her hand felt in his. They went to see the town's lawyer, a decent man named Samuel Burton, who had been a friend of Clara's father. Samuel drew up papers that outlined the partnership agreement, protecting Clara's ownership while giving James a fair share of any profits after his 6-month trial period. They both signed, Samuel witnessed it, and it was done. Clara Montgomery had a partner. James arrived at the ranch the next morning with everything he owned packed on his horse and a pack mule he had bought in town loaded with supplies. "I used the last of my savings," he explained as he unpacked lumber, nails, tools, and food supplies. "Figured if I'm going to be a partner, I should invest in our success." Our success. Clara liked the sound of that more than she wanted to admit. They fell into a routine over the next weeks that felt surprisingly natural. James took over the heavy repairs that Clara had been unable to manage alone, fixing the barn roof, reinforcing the corral, mending fence lines. Clara continued her work with the animals, the garden, and the endless domestic tasks that kept them fed and clothed. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and plan, talking about what they needed to do, how they could build up the herd, where they could save money, and where they needed to spend it. James proved to be everything he had promised and more. He worked from dawn to dusk without complaint. He was respectful of Clara and her property, and he had a quiet competence that made difficult tasks look easy. He also made her laugh, something Clara had not done much of in recent years. He told stories about his years on the trail, about the characters he had met, and the mishaps he had experienced, and he had a dry wit that caught her by surprise and made her forget her worries for a while. Clara found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, admiring the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he worked, the concentration on his face when he was focused on a task, the gentleness in his hands when he handled the animals. She caught him watching her too sometimes, and the look in his eyes made her feel things she had never felt before, a warmth that started in her chest and spread through her entire body. A month after James arrived, Clara was working on a new batch of tin flowers at her workbench in the barn. She had found more materials in town and was eager to extend the decorated fence line. James came in to put away some tools and stopped to watch her work. "How did you learn to do that?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "My mother taught me," Clara said, carefully shaping a petal with her small hammer. She was from Mexico originally, and she grew up making tin art. She said her grandmother made retablos, religious paintings on tin, and sold them to churches. My mother simplified it, made decorative things instead. She taught me before she died, said every woman should know how to make beauty from scraps. James picked up one of the finished flowers, turning it in his hands to catch the light. "She would be proud of you," he said softly. "Your father, too. You have kept their dreams alive." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She had not cried when her father died, had not let herself cry because she had to be strong to survive. But something about James's words, the kindness in them, broke through her defenses. "I miss them," she whispered. "I miss them so much, and I'm so tired of being alone." James set down the tin flower and moved closer, and then his arms were around her, pulling her against his chest. Clara stiffened for a moment, then melted into the embrace, letting herself take comfort from another human being for the first time in longer than she could remember. James smelled like hay and leather and honest sweat, and his chest was solid and warm beneath her cheek. "You are not alone anymore," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest. "I am here, and I'm not going anywhere." They stood like that for a long moment, and Clara felt something shift between them, a line being crossed that could not be uncrossed. When she finally pulled back to look up at him, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to know that this is not just about the ranch for me anymore. Maybe it never was. From the moment I saw you standing by that fence with the sun in your hair and paint on your hands, I felt something I have never felt before." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What are you saying, James?" "I am saying that I'm falling in love with you," James said, his hands moving to cup her face gently. "I am saying that every day I spend with you makes me more certain that this is where I am meant to be, not just at this ranch, but with you. I am saying that if you do not feel the same, I will respect that and never speak of it again, but I cannot keep pretending that I see you only as a business partner." Clara could hardly breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and vulnerability. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I have been trying not to, trying to be practical and smart, but I cannot help it. When you are near me, I feel alive in a way I have never felt before. When you are away, even just in another part of the ranch, I find myself listening for your voice, looking for you. I do not know if that is love, but it is something powerful, and it terrifies me." "Why does it terrify you?" James asked, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. Because I have already lost everyone I have ever loved, Clara said, tears finally spilling over. My mother, my father, and I barely survived it. If I let myself love you and then lose you, I do not think I could bear it. James pulled her close again, holding her as if he could protect her from all the pain in the world. You cannot live your life afraid of loss, he said gently. Believe me, I know. I lost my parents. I lost my home. I spent years afraid to care about anything or anyone because it hurt too much when it was taken away. But that is not living, Clara. That is just surviving. You deserve more than that. We both do. Clara knew he was right. She pulled back and looked up at him. And then she made a decision. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, tentative at first, then with more confidence as he responded. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like the coffee they had shared at breakfast. James made a small sound of surprise and pleasure, and then his arms tightened around her, and he deepened the kiss, pouring everything he felt into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. I will court you properly, he said firmly. I will not have anyone saying I took advantage of you or that we did not do things right. I am going to marry you, Clara Montgomery, if you will have me, and I am going to make sure everyone knows you are cherished and respected. Clara laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised her. We are living on the same ranch with no chaperone, James. People are already talking. Then we will get married soon, and they can talk about what a beautiful bride you were instead, James said with a grin. What do you say? Will you marry me? It was fast, Clara knew that. They had known each other barely a month, but something in her heart knew that this was right, that James was the person she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Yes, she said, smiling so wide her face hurt. Yes, I will marry you. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Santa Rosa, with Samuel Burton and his wife standing as witnesses, and a handful of other townspeople in attendance. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, which she had altered to fit her slimmer frame. James bought a new suit with money he had been saving, looking so handsome that Clara could hardly take her eyes off him as they stood before the minister and exchanged their vows. I, James Callahan, take you, Clara Montgomery, to be my lawfully wedded wife, James said, his voice strong and clear, his green eyes locked on hers. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand by your side through whatever comes. I promise to help you build your dreams and to share mine with you. I promise to be faithful to you all the days of my life. I, Clara Montgomery, take you, James Callahan, to be my lawfully wedded husband, Clara replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the emotions swirling through her. I promise to love you, respect you, and be your partner in all things. I promise to trust you with my heart and to guard yours with equal care. I promise to share my life with you, the joys and the sorrows until death parts us. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with such tender passion that Clara heard someone in the congregation sigh with romantic approval. They walked out of the church hand in hand, into the bright New Mexico sunshine, and Clara felt as if she were walking into a new life, one filled with possibilities she had not dared to imagine. The wedding night was everything Clara had hoped for, and more. James was patient and gentle, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable, and Clara discovered that the desire she had been feeling for him was returned in equal measure. They came together with a passion that surprised them both. And afterward, lying in James's arms in the bed they now shared, Clara felt a peace and contentment that she had never known was possible. I love you, James whispered into her hair, holding her close. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love you too, Clara whispered back. I think I loved you from the moment you said my fence looked like a painting. Life on the ranch became both easier and more complicated with James as her husband. Easier because the work was shared and they could accomplish twice as much together as they could separately. More complicated because Clara found herself distracted by her new husband in ways that interfered with her concentration. She would be working in the garden and look up to see him riding in from checking the herd, and the sight of him on horseback, confident and capable, would make her forget what she was doing. He would catch her looking and smile, that slow smile that made her heart race, and she would smile back, feeling like a foolish young girl instead of a practical rancher's wife. They worked together to improve the ranch, slowly but steadily. James used his knowledge from years of cattle work to trade for breeding stock, carefully building their herd. Clara expanded her vegetable garden and her chicken flock, providing food for their table and surplus to sell in town. Together they repaired the house, adding a new room that would serve as a proper parlor and someday perhaps a nursery. 6 months after their marriage, on a cool October evening, James and Clara stood together looking at the fence line that now stretched completely around the ranch's main pasture, every post adorned with Clara's tin flowers. The setting sun caught the metal and made it glow like fire, and the sight was so beautiful, it made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. "You know what we need?" James said thoughtfully, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "What is that?" Clara asked, leaning into his warmth. "A sign at the front gate. Something that tells everyone who we are and what this place means." James looked down at her with that expression that still made her heart skip a beat. "What do you say to calling it Tin Flower Ranch?" Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, the good kind this time. "Tin Flower Ranch," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "I love it. My mother would love it too." James kissed the top of her head. "Then Tin Flower Ranch it is. I will make the sign tomorrow." The sign went up the next week, a large wooden board with the name burned into it in James's careful lettering, flanked by 2 of Clara's largest and most elaborate tin flowers. People began to recognize the ranch not just by its location, but by its name, and more importantly, by its beauty. Travelers would stop to admire the fence, and word spread about the unusual ranch with the artistic decorations. The attention brought unexpected benefits. A photographer traveling through the territory asked permission to take pictures of the tin flowers, and those photographs ended up in a newspaper in Denver. A writer doing a story about life in the New Mexico territory came to interview Clara about her tin art. She told him about her mother's Mexican heritage and the tradition of tin art. And the story that resulted brought more visitors, including a wealthy woman from Santa Fe who commissioned Clara to make tin decorations for her hacienda. Clara discovered she could sell her tin art for good money, money that helped the ranch grow and prosper. James encouraged her, proud of his wife's talent and happy to see her recognized for it. He built her a proper workshop in the barn with good light and a sturdy workbench, and Clara spent her evenings there, creating flowers and more elaborate pieces, experimenting with new designs and techniques. The ranch prospered in other ways too. Their herd grew steadily, and they began to earn a reputation for quality cattle. James's years of experience and Clara's careful management combined to make them successful in a way that surprised the townspeople who had thought Clara would fail. Samuel Burton told them privately that several men in town had made bets on how long Clara would last, and they had all lost money when she not only survived but thrived. In the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, Clara realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was just the stress of a hard winter and the extra work they had been doing, but when another month passed, she had to face the truth. She was carrying James's child. She told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained since their first days together. "James," she said, taking his hand in hers, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her with immediate concern. "What is it? Are you unwell?" "No, not unwell," Clara said, smiling at his worry. "Quite the opposite, actually. James, I'm going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." James's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, disbelief, wonder, and finally pure joy. "A baby?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Truly?" "Truly," Clara confirmed. "I think the baby will come in the fall, sometime around October if my calculations are correct." James let out a whoop of joy and pulled Clara into his arms. then immediately loosened his grip as if afraid he would hurt her. "I am going to be a father," he said in wonder. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy?" James repeated. "Clara, I am more than happy. I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can hardly breathe. You have given me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I could want. A home, a family, a purpose. You have given me a life worth living." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, the hormones of pregnancy making her more emotional than usual. "You have given me the same things," she said. "I thought I was doomed to be alone, to work myself into an early grave trying to hold on to this ranch. But you saw me, really saw me, and you made me believe in possibilities again. I love you so much, James." "I love you too," James said, kissing her gently. "You and our baby. I promise I will do everything in my power to give you both a good life." The pregnancy was not easy for Clara. She suffered from morning sickness that lasted all day for the first few months, and as summer came on, the heat made her uncomfortable and swollen. But James was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over more of her work without complaint, making sure she rested when she needed to, bringing her water and whatever food she could stomach. He also became somewhat overprotective, which Clara found both sweet and frustrating. He did not want her lifting anything heavy or working in the hot sun or doing anything that he considered potentially dangerous. They had their first real argument when he tried to keep her from working in her tin flour workshop, claiming the metal dust might be harmful to the baby. "James Callahan, you listen to me," Clara said, her hands on her hips and her eyes flashing with annoyance. "I am pregnant, not dying. I have been working with tin since I was a child, and it has never hurt me. I am not going to stop doing something I love just because you are being overprotective." "I am not being overprotective," James protested. "I am being cautious. Clara, you are carrying our child. What if something happens? What if something happens while I am walking to the chicken coop? What if something happens while I am cooking dinner? You cannot protect me from everything, James, and you cannot wrap me in cotton and keep me locked in the house. That is not living." James ran his hand through his hair in frustration, a gesture Clara had come to recognize as a sign he was trying to keep his temper. "I know that. I do. But Clara, I have lost everyone I have ever loved. If I lost you or the baby because I did not do enough to protect you, I could not forgive myself." Clara's anger melted away at his words, and she crossed the room to take his hands. "James, I understand your fear because I share it. But we cannot live in fear. You taught me that, remember? We have to trust in each other and in life. I promise I will be careful. I promise I will not take unnecessary risks. But you have to promise me you will not try to control everything I do out of fear." James pulled her close as he could with her growing belly between them. "You are right," he said quietly. "I am sorry. I will try to be better about trusting you to know your own limits. And I will try to be more patient with your worry," Clara said. "We are both learning how to do this, how to be parents and partners. We will make mistakes, but we will make them together." As Clara's pregnancy advanced, they prepared for the baby's arrival. James built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving small flowers into the headboard. Clara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, and neighbors who had come to respect the young couple brought gifts and offered advice. Even Herbert from the hotel stopped by with a small gift, a wooden rattle his own grandfather had made, and mumbled something that might have been an apology for his previous rudeness. On a crisp October evening, as the first stars were appearing in the sky, Clara's labor began. James rode into town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen who was originally from California and had helped birth half the babies in the territory. She arrived at the ranch and took charge with brisk efficiency, sending James out of the room despite his protests. "Babies are women's work," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You go boil water and pace and worry like husbands do. We will call you when there's something to see." James obeyed reluctantly, and Clara could hear him pacing on the porch as her labor progressed through the night. It was hard, harder than she had imagined, and there were moments when she was sure she could not do it, could not bear the pain for another moment. But Mrs. Chen was there, encouraging her, guiding her, and just as dawn was breaking, Clara gave one final push and heard the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Mrs. Chen announced, holding up the squalling infant. A strong, healthy boy. Clara barely had time to register the words before Mrs. Chen placed the baby in her arms, and she looked down at her son for the first time. He was red-faced and wrinkled and covered in vernix, and he was absolutely perfect. He had dark hair like James and a surprisingly strong grip when his tiny fingers wrapped around Clara's thumb. "James," Clara called out, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Right, James, come meet your son." James burst through the door as if he had been shot from a cannon, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He stopped beside the bed and stared down at the baby with an expression of such awe and love that Clara felt her heart might burst. "He is beautiful," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He is perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Clara asked, and carefully transferred the baby into James's arms. James held his son with surprising confidence, supporting the small head and gazing at the baby as if he were a miracle, which Clara supposed he was. "Hello, little one," James said softly. "Welcome to Tin Flower Ranch. We have been waiting for you." They named him Michael Thomas Callahan, Michael after James's father and Thomas after Clara's. Mickey, as they quickly began calling him, was a good baby for the most part, though he had strong lungs and was not afraid to use them when he wanted something. James proved to be a devoted father, changing nappies and walking the floor with Mickey when he was fussy and singing to him in the evenings in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. Clara recovered from the birth slowly, and she was grateful for James's help with both the baby and the ranch work. She spent those early weeks in a haze of exhaustion and overwhelming love, learning to nurse Mickey, learning to interpret his different cries, learning to be a mother. It was harder than anything she had ever done, but it was also more rewarding than she could have imagined. As winter set in, they settled into a new routine as a family of 3. Clara would work in her workshop during Mickey's naps, creating new pieces that she would sell in the spring. James managed the ranch with the help of a young man from town named Pedro who had asked for work and proved to be reliable and hardworking. Pedro was 18, eager to learn, and grateful for the opportunity as work was scarce for young Mexican men in the territory, despite the fact that this land had been Mexico before the United States took it. Clara liked Pedro and appreciated his respectful manner and strong work ethic. James taught him everything he knew about cattle and horses, and Pedro soaked it up like a sponge. He was also wonderful with Mickey, making the baby laugh with funny faces and gentle tickling. Pedro reminded Clara of her mother, who had spoken Spanish and taught Clara to speak it as well, and she enjoyed conversing with him in that language, keeping those linguistic skills alive. The winter was hard, as winters in New Mexico often were, with cold nights and occasional snow. But the ranch house was warm, the barn was full of hay for the animals, and they had laid in good supplies of food. On the coldest nights, they would all gather in the main room with its fireplace, James and Clara reading while Mickey slept in his cradle, and Pedro whittled small figures from scraps of wood. One evening in January, Pedro asked Clara about her tin flowers, how she had learned to make them, and why she had decided to decorate the fence. Clara told him about her mother, about the Mexican tradition of tin art, about her desire to make the ranch beautiful as well as functional. Pedro listened intently, then shyly admitted that his grandmother had been a tinsmith in Mexico, making everything from cups to candlesticks. "Would you like to learn?" Clara asked on impulse. "I could teach you the basics, and you could add your own style. We could make even more pieces to sell, and you could earn extra money." Pedro's face lit up. "I would like that very much, Señora Clara. My grandmother used to tell me I had her hands good for detail work, but I never learned from her before she died." So Clara gained an apprentice, and Pedro proved to have real talent for the work. His pieces were different from hers, more geometric and formal, where hers were organic and flowing, but they complemented each other well. They began to develop a small business, selling their tin art not just locally, but to stores in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. The money helped the ranch continue to grow and allowed them to pay Pedro a fair wage for both his ranch work and his artistic contributions. Spring came again, the desert blooming with wildflowers, and Mickey grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby who was starting to show his own personality. He was curious about everything, always reaching for things, always wanting to see what was happening. James would carry him around the ranch, showing him the animals and explaining everything as if Mickey could understand, which made Clara smile every time she saw it. One morning in April, Clara was in her workshop with Pedro, both of them focused on their projects, when they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Clara looked up in concern. They occasionally had visitors, but not usually more than one or two at a time. Pedro moved to the window and looked out, then turned to Clara with a worried expression. "There are 5 men," he said quietly. "They do not look like they are just passing through." Clara wiped her hands and went outside, finding James already there, standing in the yard with his rifle held casually but ready. The 5 men had stopped their horses near the house, and Clara recognized the man in the lead, Cyrus Blake, a wealthy rancher who owned a spread about 20 miles to the north. He was in his 50s, with cold blue eyes and a reputation for getting what he wanted by whatever means necessary. "Blake," James said, his voice neutral, "what brings you out this way?" "Callahan," Blake replied, not bothering to dismount. "I have come to make you and your wife an offer for this place. I'm looking to expand my holdings, and your property would connect nicely to my southern boundary." "This ranch is not for sale," Clara said clearly, moving to stand beside James. "We have built a good life here, and we intend to stay." Blake's eyes moved to Clara, and she did not like what she saw in them. "Now, Mrs. Callahan, you should leave business discussions to the men. I am prepared to offer a fair price, more than this place is worth, really. You and your husband could take the money and start over somewhere else, somewhere easier." "You heard my wife," James said, his voice hardening. "Tin Flower Ranch is not for sale. Not now, not ever. We would appreciate it if you and your men would leave our property." Blake's genial expression disappeared, replaced by something darker. "I tried to be polite about this," he said coldly, "but let me be clear. I want this land, and I'm going to get it one way or another. You can take my generous offer and walk away with money in your pockets, or you can be stubborn and find out what happens to people who stand in my way. Either way, this land will be mine." James raised his rifle, not pointing it at Blake, but making his readiness clear. "I said leave. Now." The men with Blake tensed, their hands moving to their own guns, and Clara felt her heart racing with fear. This could turn violent very quickly, but before anyone could make a move, Pedro stepped out of the barn with the old shotgun they kept there, and Mrs. Chen, who had come to check on Mickey, appeared on the porch with a rifle of her own. "You are outnumbered, Blake," James said quietly, "and I am a very good shot. I do not want to kill anyone today, but I will protect my family and my home. Make the smart choice and ride away." Blake stared at James for a long moment, and Clara could see him calculating the odds. Finally, he gave a cold smile. "This is not over, Callahan. You and your wife have made an enemy today, and you will regret it." He turned his horse and rode off, his men following, but the threat in his words hung in the air. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "What are we going to do?" she asked James. "He meant that threat. He is going to come after us." "I know," James said grimly. "Blake has a reputation for using intimidation and violence to get what he wants, but we are not going to be scared away from our own land." He looked at Pedro and Mrs. Chen, who had lowered their weapons. "Thank you both. Your help might have saved our lives." "Of course, Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly. "I have lived in this territory long enough to know men like Blake. He is a bully and a thief. We need to be prepared for him to try something else." She was right, of course. Over the next weeks, a series of unfortunate events plagued the ranch. Fence rails were cut, allowing cattle to wander. Someone left a gate open, and it took James and Pedro 2 days to round up all the animals. A fire started mysteriously in the hay barn, though they caught it quickly and managed to put it out before it spread. There was no proof that Blake was behind any of it, but they all knew the truth. James rode into Santa Rosa and filed a complaint with the sheriff, but the sheriff, a man named Williams, who was known to be in Blake's pocket, was unsympathetic. "I cannot do anything without proof," he said with a shrug. "Maybe you're just having bad luck. Ranching is a hard business." Clara was furious and frightened. She did not want to lose everything they had built, but she also did not want anyone to get hurt or killed in a range war. She and James talked late into the night, trying to figure out what to do. "We could hire more men," James suggested. "Make it clear we are willing to defend ourselves." "That would take money we do not have," Clara pointed out, "and it could escalate things into real violence. Maybe we should consider selling after all. No piece of land is worth dying for." "This is not just land," James said intensely. "This is our home. This is where we built our life together, where our son was born, where your mother's memory lives on in every tin flower on those fences. If we let Blake bully us off our land, what does that say to Mickey about standing up for what is right?" Clara knew he was correct, but she was still scared. She had lost so much in her life, and the thought of losing James or their home was almost unbearable. But she also knew that running away was not the answer. The solution came from an unexpected source. Samuel Burton, the lawyer who had drawn up their partnership papers and witnessed their wedding, arrived at the ranch a few days later with surprising news. "I have been doing some research," he said, settling into a chair in their parlor with a cup of coffee. "Blake has been buying up land all over this region, using intimidation and sometimes outright fraud. I have found several cases where he forged signatures on deeds or forced sales under duress. I am working with a federal marshal to build a case against him." "How long will that take?" James asked. "Weeks, maybe months," Samuel admitted. "But in the meantime, I want you to know you have allies. Many of the smaller ranchers and farmers in the area are tired of Blake's tactics. If he comes after you again, I believe we can organize a response. There is strength in numbers." Samuel was true to his word. He helped organize a coalition of the smaller landowners in the region, people who had all suffered under Blake's intimidation. They agreed to help each other, to come to each other's aid if Blake or his men caused trouble. It was a risky strategy, but it was better than facing Blake alone. The showdown came sooner than anyone expected. One evening in late May, Blake and more than a dozen of his men rode onto Tin Flower Ranch property, clearly intending to cause serious damage or harm. But they found themselves facing not just James, Clara, and Pedro, but 20 armed men and women from surrounding properties, all of them ready to defend their neighbors and their own interests. The federal marshal, a tough man named Harrison, who had been investigating Blake, was there as well. "Cyrus Blake," he called out in a voice that carried across the yard, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder. You and your men are under arrest." Blake looked around at the armed crowd, at the marshal with his badge and his rifle, and Clara saw the moment he realized he had lost. His face turned red with rage, but he was smart enough to know when he was beaten. "This is not legal," he protested. "I have friends in high places." "Not high enough," Marshal Harrison said flatly. "Dismount and surrender your weapons, all of you." The arrest of Blake and several of his key men broke the power structure he had built. An investigation revealed the extent of his illegal activities, including multiple fraudulent land deals and at least 2 murders that could be tied to him. He was eventually sent to prison, and his ranch was broken up and sold to pay his debts and compensate his victims. Clara and James could hardly believe it was over. They had faced down a serious threat and survived thanks to their own courage and the help of their community. The experience brought them even closer together and strengthened their ties to their neighbors. Tin Flower Ranch became known not just for its beauty, but for the courage of its owners. Life settled back into a more peaceful routine. Mickey continued to grow, becoming a toddler who was into everything with his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair. He loved the ranch animals, especially the horses, and James started teaching him to ride on a gentle old mare before his second birthday. Clara watched her husband and son together and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful in its intensity. Pedro continued to work for them and to develop his skills in tin art. He eventually met a young woman in town, Maria, who was the daughter of the general store owner. They courted properly and married a year later, and James and Clara gave them a piece of land at the eastern edge of the ranch to build their own house. Pedro remained their partner in both the ranching and the artistic enterprises, and his wife Maria proved to be a talented businesswoman who helped expand their sales of tin art. The tin flowers that lined the fences of Tin Flower Ranch became something of a legend in the territory. Travelers would go out of their way to see them, and Clara's work was featured in magazines and newspapers. She was commissioned to create pieces for wealthy families in Santa Fe and even as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The little ranch that had been struggling when Clara inherited it became prosperous and well-known. 3 years after Mickey was born, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect and was not as anxious. James was still overprotective but better at hiding it, and Clara was better at accepting his care without feeling smothered. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose for the wild roses that grew along the creek on the ranch property, was born on a beautiful spring morning with much less drama than Mickey's birth. Rose was different from her brother from the start. Where Mickey had been active and curious, Rose was calm and observant, watching everything with serious dark eyes. She looked more like Clara than James, with delicate features and skin that tanned to a warm bronze in the summer sun. Mickey adored his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and proudly showing her all around the ranch as soon as she was old enough to be carried around. The years passed in a happy blur of work and love and family. The ranch continued to prosper, their cattle herd growing to a respectable size. Clara's tin art business expanded beyond anything she had imagined, with Pedro and Maria hiring additional workers to help meet the demand. They built a proper workshop separate from the barn, with good light and ventilation and space for multiple people to work at once. James proved to have a gift for training horses, and he began a breeding program that produced quality animals that sold for good prices. Mickey followed in his father's footsteps, showing a natural talent with horses and a love for ranch work. Rose, when she was old enough, showed more interest in the artistic side of things, spending hours in the workshop with her mother and Pedro, learning to shape tin into beautiful objects. When Mickey was 10 and Rose was 7, Clara realized she was pregnant again, a surprise after several years of no more children. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two, perhaps because Clara was now in her early 30s and her body found the experience more challenging. She was sick more often and tired more easily, and James fussed over her constantly. "I am fine," Clara would protest, though secretly she was grateful for his care. "I have done this twice before." "And you will humor me by resting when you are tired and letting other people do the heavy work," James would reply firmly, and Clara would sigh and obey, because she loved him and because she was, in fact, very tired. Their third child, another boy they named William after James's grandfather, was born in early winter during the first snow of the season. He was smaller than his siblings had been at birth, and the labor was longer and more difficult. Mrs. Chen, who had attended all 3 births, looked worried at several points, and Clara knew that this birth was more dangerous than the others had been. But she pushed through it, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, and finally William entered the world with a loud, indignant cry that made everyone laugh with relief. He was smaller, yes, but perfectly formed and healthy, with a full head of black hair and lungs that worked very well indeed. James held his new son with tears streaming down his face. "3 children," he said in wonder. "Clara, you have given me 3 beautiful children. How did I get so lucky?" "We got lucky," Clara corrected him, reaching up to touch his face. "We found each other when we both needed finding. Everything good in our lives has come from that." William, quickly nicknamed Will, proved to be a determined child who refused to let his smaller size hold him back. He kept up with his older siblings through sheer stubbornness, and he had a quick mind that impressed everyone. As he grew, it became clear that he had inherited his mother's artistic talent and his father's head for business, a combination that would serve him well. The children grew up surrounded by love and beauty, by the practical demands of ranch life and the creative joy of making art. They learned to work hard, to appreciate both the functional and the beautiful, to stand up for what was right. They heard the story of how their mother had lined the fence with tin flowers and how their father had stopped to admire them, recognizing something special. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. They learned that love was a choice you made every day, in big ways and small. Mickey grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with a natural gift for working with animals and the land. He married at 23 a young woman named Sarah, who was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they settled on a piece of land that James and Clara gave them, expanding the family holdings. Sarah fit into the family perfectly, sharing Clara's love of beauty and practical nature. She learned to make tin art from Clara and added her own innovations, including painted designs that were striking and original. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's artistic talent and her father's stubborn determination. She had no interest in marrying young, insisting she wanted to develop her art first. She traveled to Santa Fe to study with established artists, then returned to the ranch and opened a gallery that showcased not just her family's tin art, but the work of other local artists as well. She eventually married at 28. A quiet man named David, who was a teacher, and they had 2 daughters who carried on the family's artistic traditions. Will, the youngest, proved to have a head for business that none of his siblings possessed. He managed the financial side of the family's various enterprises, expanding their tin art business to include a mail-order catalog that reached customers all over the country. He married a smart, capable woman named Elizabeth who shared his business acumen, and together they made the family business more successful than Clara had ever dreamed possible. Through it all, James and Clara remained the heart of Tin Flower Ranch. They grew older together, their dark hair turning gray and then white, their faces becoming lined with the marks of years spent in the sun and wind, but their love for each other never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and stronger, tempered by shared experiences and mutual respect. They still sat on the porch every evening when weather permitted, watching the sunset and talking about their day, just as they had when they were newly married. James still looked at Clara with wonder sometimes, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. Clara still felt her heart skip a beat when James smiled at her in that particular way that was just for her. "Do you remember the day we met?" Clara asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, sitting in their usual spots on the porch with grandchildren playing in the yard before them. "Every detail," James replied, taking her hand in his. "You were standing by the fence, putting up tin flowers, and you had paint on your face and determination in your eyes. I took one look at you in that fence, and I knew my life was about to change." "I thought you were crazy," Clara admitted with a laugh. "A stranger offering to partner with me when you did not know anything about me except that I wasted time making decorations." "It was not wasted time," James said, as he had said so many times over the years. "It was an investment in beauty, in hope, in making this place a home instead of just a property. You taught me that, Clara. You taught me that beauty is not frivolous but necessary, that taking time to create something lovely is as important as any of the practical work we do." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses that had been there since the first time they touched. "And you taught me that I did not have to be alone, that letting someone in was not weakness but strength. You taught me that love was worth the risk of loss." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the grandchildren play. Mickey's oldest son was teaching Rose's youngest daughter how to rope a fence post, both of them laughing at their failed attempts. Will's twins were examining something in the garden, probably a bug or a lizard, with the intense focus children brought to such discoveries. "We built something good here," James said quietly, "something that will last beyond us." "We did," Clara agreed, "and it all started with tin flowers on a fence." Pedro and Maria, now in their 60s as well, remained close friends and partners in the business. They had raised 5 children of their own on their piece of the ranch, and their family and the Callahan family were so intertwined that it was sometimes hard to remember they were not actually related by blood. Pedro had developed into a master tinsmith whose work was as sought after as Clara's, and together they had trained dozens of apprentices over the years, keeping the tradition of tin art alive and evolving. As Clara and James entered their 70s, they began to slow down, letting their children and grandchildren take over more of the day-to-day work of running the ranch and the business, but they never stopped creating. Clara still spent time in her workshop, her hands perhaps not as steady as they once were, but still capable of producing beautiful work. James still worked with the horses, though now he mostly advised and supervised while younger hands did the physical labor. The tin flowers that had started everything were still there, lining the fences of Tin Flower Ranch. Some of the original ones had been replaced over the years as they weathered and wore, but many remained, a testament to Clara's vision and skill. New flowers had been added by Clara, by Pedro, by their children and grandchildren, so that the fences were now an evolving work of art that represented generations of creativity and love. Visitors still came to see the famous tin flowers, and the ranch had become something of a tourist attraction. James and Clara had mixed feelings about this, enjoying the appreciation of their work, but sometimes missing the privacy of earlier years. But they adapted, as they had always adapted, and found that most visitors were respectful and genuinely interested in the art and the history behind it. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration that brought together family, friends, and neighbors from all over the territory. The party was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter, and at the center of it all were James and Clara, still holding hands, still looking at each other with love. Mickey stood up to give a toast, his voice carrying across the crowd. "My parents taught us many things," he said. "They taught us to work hard, to stand up for what is right, to appreciate beauty in all its forms. But most importantly, they taught us what real love looks like. Not the easy romantic love of storybooks, but the harder, deeper love that weathers storms and celebrates joys, that chooses commitment every day, that grows stronger with time. My father once said that my mother made this ranch look like a painting, but what he really saw was that she made a life that was a work of art. And they have spent 50 years creating that life together. To James and Clara Callahan, the best parents and the best example of love anyone could ask for." The crowd raised their glasses and cheered, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face. James pulled her close and kissed her, right there in front of everyone, and the crowd cheered again. "I love you," he whispered in her ear, "today, tomorrow, and every day after that." "I love you too," Clara whispered back, "for the rest of our lives and beyond." They had several more good years together, years filled with the simple pleasures of a life well lived. They saw more grandchildren born and some great-grandchildren as well. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, weathered sorrows and hardships, and found joy in the everyday moments of life on the ranch they had built together. James passed away first, quietly in his sleep at the age of 78, with Clara holding his hand. She grieved deeply, the loss cutting her to the core, but she did not regret a single moment they had shared. She had loved him fully and been loved fully in return, and that was a gift not everyone received. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by family, working in her workshop when she felt up to it, sitting on the porch every evening and remembering the man who had stopped to admire her tin flowers all those years ago. Clara lived for another 5 years after James's death, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She passed away peacefully at the age of 81, sitting in her workshop with a half-finished tin flower in front of her, surrounded by the art that had been such a central part of her life. Her children found her there, and they knew she had gone the way she would have wanted, doing what she loved in the place she loved. They buried Clara next to James in the small cemetery at the edge of the ranch property, under a cottonwood tree that provided shade and shelter. Mickey, Rose, and Will stood together at their parents' graveside, their own children and grandchildren around them, and they remembered the lessons they had been taught, the love they had witnessed, the legacy that had been passed on to them. Tin Flower Ranch continued to thrive under the management of the second and third generations. The tin art business expanded even further, with pieces in museums and galleries across the country. The cattle operation remained successful, and additional enterprises were added over the years. But at the heart of it all, the tin flowers remained, lining the fences and catching the light, a permanent reminder of where it all began. The story of Clara and James became a legend in the New Mexico territory and beyond. People told it to their children. The romantic tale of a young woman alone who made beauty from scraps and a young cowboy who recognized something special when he saw it. They told how love had grown from that first meeting, how courage and determination had helped them overcome challenges, how they had built a life and a legacy that lasted long after they were gone. And every spring, as the desert bloomed with wildflowers and the sun grew warm again, the tin flowers on the fences of Tin Flower Ranch would shine in the light, a celebration of beauty, hope, and love that never faded. New flowers were added each year by new generations, each one unique, each one a tribute to the woman who had started it all and the man who had seen her for who she truly was. The ranch house still stood, maintained lovingly by Clara and James's descendants. The workshop where Clara had created her art was preserved as a museum, open to visitors who wanted to see where the magic had happened. The porch where Clara and James had spent so many evenings was still there, still a favorite spot for family members to sit and watch the sunset and remember the two people who had created this legacy. In the main house, in a place of honor, hung a photograph taken on Clara and James's 50th wedding anniversary. In it, they stood together by the fence with its tin flowers, James's arm around Clara's shoulders, both of them smiling at the camera with the contentment of people who had lived well and loved deeply. Below the photograph was a small plaque with words that had been repeated so often they had become part of the family lore. She lined the fence with tin flowers. The cowboy said, "You have made this ranch look like a painting." And together they created a masterpiece that lasted forever. The legacy of Tin Flower Ranch was not just the land or the business or even the art, though all of those were important. The real legacy was the example Clara and James had set, the proof that love could overcome obstacles, that beauty and practicality could coexist, that two people who found each other at the right moment could build something that lasted long after they were gone. Their great-great-grandchildren played in the same yard where Clara had first shown James her tin flowers. They learned to ride horses in the same corral where James had trained countless animals. They learned to work with tin in the same workshop where Clara had created her art. And they learned the story of how it all began, with a lonely young woman determined to make beauty in a harsh land, and a traveling cowboy wise enough to see the beauty not just in her art, but in her. The tin flowers still caught the sun, still transformed ordinary fence posts into something extraordinary, still made the ranch look like a painting. And in that beauty, in that determination to create something lovely in the midst of hard work and difficult circumstances, lived the spirit of Clara Montgomery Callahan, the woman who had refused to let her world be only practical, who had insisted that beauty was necessary, who had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. And beside her, always, was the spirit of James Callahan, the cowboy who had been wise enough to stop his horse and take notice, brave enough to offer his help and his heart, and devoted enough to spend the rest of his life proving that his love was true. Together they had created something that transcended the ordinary, something that inspired generations, something that proved that love, when it is real and true and nurtured daily, can indeed last forever. The sun set over Tin Flower Ranch as it had set thousands of times before, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The tin flowers caught the last rays of light and glowed like fire, like stars, like promises kept and dreams fulfilled. And if you listened carefully, you might almost hear the echo of voices on the porch, two people talking softly as they watched the sunset together, their hands intertwined, their love as enduring as the land itself. This was the legacy of Tin Flower Ranch, the legacy of Clara and James Callahan, not just a successful business or a beautiful piece of land, but a testament to the power of love, the necessity of beauty, and the courage to believe that two people together could create something far greater than either could create alone. It was a legacy that would endure as long as the tin flowers shone in the sun, as long as there were people who believed that love was worth fighting for, that beauty was worth creating, that life was worth living fully and passionately with someone you loved by your side. And so the story ended where it began, with tin flowers on a fence and a cowboy's admiring words, with love that transformed an ordinary ranch into something extraordinary, with two people who found each other when they needed finding and built a life that became a legend. It was a story of the Wild West, of hard work and harder choices, of danger faced and overcome, of a community that came together, of children raised and a legacy created. But most of all, it was a love story, the kind that proved that real love was not just about the big romantic gestures, but about the everyday choice to stand together, to build together, to create beauty together in whatever form that beauty took. The tin flowers remained shining in the sun, a permanent reminder that Clara Montgomery had once lined a fence with beauty, and that James Callahan had been wise enough to recognize what he was seeing. Together they had painted a life that was more beautiful than any canvas, more enduring than any sculpture, more meaningful than any monument. They had created Tin Flower Ranch, and in doing so, they had created a legacy of love that would never fade, never tarnish, never be forgotten. And that, in the end, was the greatest work of art of all.